Welcome back to another episode of Beggar's Canyon. We got Pastor Brian, Pastor Drake, and April
Not a
with
pastor.
us.
Not a pastor.
Pastor April.
Not a pastor.
Not a pastor. That's actually going to be another episode pretty soon, right?
Yes. Yes.
We'll talk about. It's actually on the same channel that did the Canaanite.
Is it really? I didn't realize.
The things your pastor didn't tell you.
Oh, okay.
I've actually really
that explains a lot.
Yeah, I actually really enjoy that channel.
Things your female pastor didn't
Things
tell
your
you.
female
Is
pastor
actually
didn't
the
tell
name
you.
of the channel.
Right.
But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is a very hot topic. It pushes a lot of buttons, fumes a lot of evangelicals. And what is that topic today?
Contraception.
Contraception. Man, okay. And I know it's a big subject, and I think we're going to try to, portion it up so that it's palatable for our viewers. But where are we gonna start this afternoon? We're going to start with the history, or maybe we should start with defining what is contraception.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And I was going to read from groundbreaking book.
Groundbreaking.
What book are you reading from?
This is The Christian Case Against Contraception.
Okay.
Which I wrote in my early 30s.
Wow.
I would.
John Calvin wrote his first book in his 20s.
Well, and this one is nowhere near as good as Calvin's, but I want to read maybe a couple paragraphs before I get to the definition. And so what I say is this. It is important before we begin to define our terms so that there will be little room for confusion. When we speak of quote-unquote contraception, or the broader term birth control, certain images of pills may come to mind. However, as we will see, birth control is a mindset and intention more than it is a device that is used. In fact, it will be argued that the use of a device is not necessary for a practice to fall under the category of birth control or contraception. I won't go into the second paragraph there, but here's basically the definition I give to it. By birth control or contraception, I mean any practice with or without a device that is intended to be used by an individual involved in the sexual act in an effort to prevent the climax of that act from creating an opportunity for God to bring forth a covenant child through the natural created means of the biological processes that he has set in place. Kind of a long definition, but it's important because ultimately people think contraception and they think of the pill. They're not thinking of various practices. They're anti-contraceptive sexual practices. They're thinking of devices used or, condoms or something of that nature. And it's more than that. I actually hated the fact that they put like a thing of pills on the cover of the book because I think it confuses the issue to where we're just talking about unnatural contraception like the Roman Catholic Church today since Vatican II does. But in reality, we're talking about just a contraceptive mindset in general to where you are attempting to avoid a child coming about through the sexual act, through the coitus.
I think that's an important distinction because it widens the gate now because really ultimately we're talking about a heart problem. Contraception, it's going to manifest itself in physical ways because we're physical beings and we manipulate our reality through those. So we're going to use things like, what's on the cover of your book, pills, but or condoms or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, going to what you said, like if we look at the Roman Catholic Church, where contraception is not something they ascribe to, but you can actually plan, biologically when a woman is fertile or not, and avoid the sexual act. And if we're just looking at the material manifestation of contraception, we would say, well, that sounds okay to me. That that sounds like the power that God has given us in our being, in our will to be able to make those kind of decisions.
Well, I think it's important too to realize that when people say contraception, they usually think, oh, that's, if you're against contraception, you're just like the Amish or something. Right. Well, that's a modern invention, and you're just afraid of, it's like Phil Hartman's Lawyer Caveman or whatever, right. If you ever saw that SNL. Yeah. It's like, I'm afraid of your bright lights. And, it's that sort of like, oh, you're afraid of technology. What people don't realize is birth control has been around since The Egyptians used it, the Sumerians used it in Mesopotamia. Everyone has used it from the beginning of time. It's as old as dirt. I mean, so it's not a modern invention. And it's important for us, I think, to realize then how have the people of God, both biblically and historically, responded to what the entire world accepted as a responsible practice.
Yeah.
Well, and as we are talking about this, we're going to be looking at a Bright Hearth episode. It was one of their earlier episodes, and they talk about church history very briefly. They touch on it. And so we'll go ahead and respond to that and see, is their argument coming from a place of deep historical knowledge on the subject, or is it coming from more of a modern perspective that then is being read into the past, or
a reinterpretation,
or a dismissal of the weightiness of what Christians have had to deal with throughout church history? This is not just an issue about technology. It's not an issue about particular methods like we've talked about. It is, like Drake said, at the heart of it, a sin issue. And it's a sin issue that has been addressed in church history and has only been thought of recently in other ways.
Well, and I think it's important to realize, too, that I think people are going to be shocked because it's not just a matter of the church has decided, oh, yeah, it's not so good to use it. It will be put in the category of murder. People teachers who talk about it, it's clear that it's something that the infidels do. It's something that those are going to hell do. If you were to use it, for instance, one practice of a church in history was to not allow you to take communion for a decade, and you were only allowed to take it if you were on your deathbed within that time period. Wow. And that's if you were repentant. So it was seen as an absolute crime against God. It was not tolerated by the church at all. So it's not just, oh, well, these just older people had kind of an idea that wasn't, that great, but it's not that bad. They thought they put it on par with abortion. They put it on par with homosexuality or just egregious sex crimes. Cyprian
would actually extend that and say someone who would abort or treat, especially in the marriage bed, treat their wife as a whore, as he would say, is worse than an unbeliever or a pagan doing their wicked practices. You actually, whatever judgment is being prepared in that unrepentant state, if you're doing that to your wife, is much worse than any pagan sexual immorality.
This will be repeated, right? You'll have Augustine say things that, you're treating your wife like a prostitute. That's what prostitutes.
And that was about the rhythm method, which is what we would call natural family planning today.
Sure.
That was his condemnation of it was that strong.
Well, and you'll get reformers saying things like, not only have you wiped out a child, but you've wiped out all the generations that would come from that child. And if you think about it, that's just that sounds crazy to us, but in reality, I often think of, over the course of the years, was this worth it for me to write this book? And I've gotten so much grief for it and pushback and all that or whatever. But then, I'm not saying this is a vision that I got, but I've had almost, I think God pop an image in my head of all the generations of people that have come forth from the children that have been born from this. And if that's true, that you're going to have generations of people, you're going to have up to tens of thousands of people possibly, maybe millions from whoever, has had a child and they weren't going to, and now they have because of the book or whatever. Isn't that what you're then wiping out if you don't? Isn't that what you're attempting to wipe out with contraception? So it's a much more serious issue than I think most people think. That we're taught that it's a preference issue, and we're taught it's a preference issue for a reason, and it's actually a historical reason that has taken place, that the teleology of sexuality has been changed from a biblical Christian one to a modern one that's based in, frankly, the post-modernity of our time. So,
and real quick, the teleology meaning the story, or what is the purpose? What is God
Yeah,
what is
what's the goal? What's the
what's
purpose,
the purpose
of an act or something?
I want to. This might be a Drake tale, duck tale. But I do want to say this. If we look at antiquity and church history, like Augustine or Cyprian or any of the early church fathers or patristics, when they're addressing contraception, there is a different mindset than we have today. So before there's a pit against two worldviews, right? Really, like the ancient Mesopotamian understanding of the issue with overpopulation and things like that, in relation to how we control how many children that we have with the amount of crops that we have and stuff. The postmodern man, while that might be in the background, I think there's something way more wicked and way deeper. We know the 20th century was the deadliest century in recorded, other than the flood probably. I don't know how many people died in the flood. But in yeah, that's another podcast, right? but we're talking millions upon millions upon millions of people dying, right? Almost like factorial, like a manufacturer. Like they're on a conveyor belt going into this burn pit, and life became kind of just whatever. People die. There's no really any meaning. We have these wars. People are just going to massacre each other, and the best thing we can do is kind of hunker down, try to be at peace with one another. But life has lost its. You use the word teleology, but it's lost its teleology in like an existential crisis. So like the church today, when they're thinking about family planning, like they don't even understand like the value of life, period, because we live in a time where the meaning of life is so varied and so meaningless really, because of all the death that we've experienced in the last 150 years.
Well, the First World War was actually blamed on overpopulation as well. And so you can see that overpopulation, what people refer to as the Malthusian or the Neo-Malthusian argument, that crime or evil exists in the world mainly because there's too many people. And you see that resurface from even like Atrahasis, which is the ancient, Mesopotamian argument for overpopulation. And so that seems to be at least a justification, the initial justification for it. But as you said, in postmodernity, where, can we really understand anything about God? Is there a God in the first place? If there is, we can't really, how do we know his will? Well, maybe it's just individual and there's no religion that can tell me what his will is. And so things become very individualistic. And so by the time of the sexual revolution, well, sex is very individualistic. So whatever you preferentially want for sex, that's what's justified. So if you want babies, great. If you just want pleasure, great. If you want more intimate relationship with your spouse or whoever, then great. But it's what you are the God who decides what sex is about, because that's what postmodernity does. We're the gods who decide what is true and what is good through our personal preferences, through our traditions, through whatever our intuition or whatever it may be, going back to the past podcast. Like intuitively, we figure it out for ourselves, and we provide the teleology rather than looking and asking, did God provide a teleology for sexuality already, biblically and historically?
I don't think that there's any disconnect between the overpopulation argument and that argument in the modern times. And what I mean by that is, like, if you look at China's one-child policy, that was specifically done because of perceived overpopulation in China. Right. And if you look at, in a reformed context, maybe this is a strange analogy, we'll see. Just follow me.
Does that have to do with fingers? Or?
Yeah, no. If you think in a reformed context, we talk about the family being the smallest form of government. So when you have the father essentially saying, we can't have another child because we don't have enough resources in our house. That is an overpopulation argument,
right?
But it's on a micro scale,
right? It's an individual assessment.
It's the same argument. It's just done in a different way,
right?
So if we're gonna say the one-child policy in China is evil, why, as Christians, do we think it's evil? Is it just because it's infringing on our bodily autonomy, Or is it that there is something deeper to it, that it is actually evil for a government to limit the number of children, or for you to limit the number of children that you have?
Well, the irony is that the correct assumption of that would, or the correct assessment of that would be, it's evil for the Chinese government to do that. But I would agree with you. I actually think that it's the assessment itself that it's wrong. The reasoning for it is actually evil, because really it's just, nobody's going to tell me what to do. So it's really just a rebellion type idea, rather than looking at it and being like, it's evil because we're to be fruitful and multiply, and that's hindering what God told us to do, and therefore it's evil. It's not for the right reasons that most people think it's wrong. It's just because they're caged in, and most rebellious people in our flesh don't want to be caged in.
But Reformed people will do this in the same way. So China has said, it was one-child policy, in the 80s, and then it moved to 2, it moved to 3. But Reformed people do this, 5 is enough. That's our population cutoff in our family.
Yeah.
Or 6 is enough, or 7. Whatever arbitrary number you choose, you're still playing God. You're still saying, well, we can only support in our family, in our context, 5 kids, 6 kids. You are being China in your house.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that it's you, along those lines, you can have 20 kids and still be a rebellious person. Like, I've known big families and they don't have a solid, good sexual ethic. They just wanted big families. You can be a family that has no kids, but you desperately desire them and you're wanting to be obedient to God, and God has just decided not to give you children. So it really has nothing to do with how many kids you have. It has to do with how you treat the sexual act and whether you're in submission into that area of your life to Jesus Christ or not.
Yeah, and that goes back to the heart problem, and I think one of the tests for us, for Reformed or any Christian, and if someone were to ask you, what lengths will you go to obey Christ and what He says, most will say, well, I'll give up my life. I'll give up everything.
I'll go to the jungles of Africa.
I'll go to the jungles of Africa. I'll go to the,
because that's vacation.
Deserted island and get speared by a tribe.
Well, because people know they're never actually going to be called on to do that. So it's sort of like, yes, I'll go to the jungles of Africa. Well, yeah, okay, then go do it.
Well, then God says, actually, get married and then have a family and then let me be.
So, whoa.
Hold on a second. God's given me the ability to discern. And like April said, and now we become these mini totalitarian government. And it's even worse for us because at least China will say it's a material issue.
Yeah.
We'll say, I don't emotionally have the resources to have. You're like, whoa. Like, you have the Holy Spirit in you and you have a limit of emotional resources? Like, show me where that happened. We're the apostles.
Well, it's from all of the fact that you have to get up early in the morning to start cooking, and then you have to, wash all your clothes in the river, and it takes like a week to wash them. It's like, oh no, we live in the modern day when it actually those things take about half an hour now.
Right now, and people read Paul, and in Corinthians, right, when he's talking about, hey, look, it would be better if you stayed single. Why? Well, because the married man has to think of worldly things and not in an evil sense, but he has to think about his wife. But he also has to think about who's connected to his wife, which is all the children you're going to have. Yeah. And now, instead of doing Bible study and I don't know, doing things that would going to whatever city, you have to stay home and actually make sure that family's fed, and that's distracting, and it's good. But there's an expectation that there's an openness that God can make your family massively taxing materially, massively taxing emotionally, and it could alter your life as much as you turning from wickedness into the city of darkness, city of light kind of life-changing event. All that, and that is a hard thing to give to say. Okay, God, here. Take everything.
You are really, this is not, hey, do you believe in the Trinity or not? Like, if you believe in the Trinity, it should affect your life, but people aren't that deep to really understand why the Trinity would affect your life all that much.
Right.
So it's almost like a I can take it or leave it type thing. But this actually is massively life altering.
Yeah.
because it's not just, everyone imagines, or for most people at least, they imagine that you're going to have like, 1 or 2 kids or something. And so you prepare for that. But what if God were to give you like 12 kids?
We're to bless you with 12 kids.
Right, exactly. Well, we don't even think of it that way. We're even the way that we phrase it, it's as burden, right? It's and look,
how many rocks in my backpack are you going to give me?
yeah, to a degree. Look, if I have to carry around gold all day, if I have like, someone gives me a pack of gold, it's a burden.
Yeah.
Am I willing to take the yes, please burden me with gold. And yet, yes, it is a burden to have children. Let's not act like it's not a burden. Of course it is. But is it absolutely worth it? Yes. 1, because you're obeying God. And 2, I think it's very clear that it has to do with our sanctification. And this is why even Paul, who remains celibate and single and all of that, he still becomes a father. I think fatherhood and motherhood are part of our sanctification. And at any point when we become murderers as fathers or murderers as mothers, it is contrary to sanctification, and it does something to the soul.
The last thing I'll say, and then we can maybe move on to the video, unless you guys want to continue on with something else. But in relation to thinking about children in like the postmodern sense, and the existential crisis that we have, looking at our lives as finite. If we look at we look at pets as like, oh, they're fun for a time, then they'll die, 6-10 years, and then we'll get new pets, and
or if you're really bad at taking care of them, like 6 months.
Or they might last 6 years, so it's my fault.
Yeah.
But I, as Christians, even because I think we're so inculcated with the Enlightenment ideas that most of us got in school and whatnot, we don't see humans or children as eternal beings. That we're actually with God in consummation in marriage, life coming from almost nothing, right? Almost nothing. But God's, whatever spark happens that is you can't explain, science can't explain it. It's not something that we can understand. Now you've created, and with God's, right, with the promise of God bringing these children up as covenant children, like you're putting people on a new heavens and new earth that will live there forever. Like,
you're not.
Well, it is interesting that people do talk about it as though, like, how many dogs do you want to have?
Yeah.
And then when they don't have children in our culture, what do? They buy a dog. And it's sort of, or a cat or whatever. And it is almost the mindset of like, children or pets, how many do you want to have? And it's like, these are eternal beings created by God, not some machine that is your body.
Well, that's really where it comes down to is who is doing the creating? Right. Are you a participant with God in the creation, or are you somehow rebelling and fighting against him in that?
Yeah.
And if you're saying, well, I can only have kids at this particular time, or they'll talk about child spacing in this video when we'll get to this after. It really is, I get to choose, I decide, I'm the one determining if a child's created, and there is no real understanding that God is the one who is opening and closing the womb.
Yeah.
That is actually what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting, we'll get to the biblical portion, but I do think it's interesting in Genesis is that Genesis is countering that idea that we're the creators by showing God consistently, not only like creating through people, but also shutting off the womb in Genesis.
Yeah.
So that even if you want to have kids, that's too bad. Or if you can't have kids, it's God who has them through you. So it's God actually the one making the decision. As a counter to people who are like, oh, I'm the one who makes the decision, so I'm going to limit my kids. For instance, like Onan or people engaged in different sexual practices that are not procreative. So anyway, we'll get to that. That's the biblical portion, but I do think that that's an interesting. We are heavily saturated with naturalism from the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment culture in which we breathe. It's the water in which we swim. And so it's all over us. It's all over our ideas. And we have come to believe that we make children. It's a natural process. And therefore, all we're doing is throwing a wrench in the machine. Well, what's wrong with that? As opposed to believing that God's the one who actually makes children, and he morally decides and wills that every human being that exists So ultimately the question becomes, well, what am I doing then? What am I trying to do? What's the attempt to do? If God is going to make a human being and I'm like, no, I'm trying to prevent that human being from being made, is that me working with God and being procreative or working against him?
And just for our viewers, a warning from Scripture, and then I'll be done, I promise. Going back to like the some people might, if you're hearing this and be like, well, I'll never get married, I don't want to get married, that's too much of a burden on me or something like that. Paul's very clear about like, hey, if you can't control your desires, you need to get married, right? So you can't burn with passion. So if it scares you, like, well, okay, to be faithful in marriage, then I have to have kids, so I'll just be single. But then you're someone that can't control yourself. Like, obviously, you're not a eunuch. You haven't made yourself a eunuch, as Christ talks about, or anything like that. You need to get married. But then you need to like go full in and say, okay, that means then that marriage produces children.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just being anti-procreative in your singleness.
Yeah.
And Paul's really just saying, hey, get married so that you can channel that into a procreative relationship.
So we're going to go ahead and we'll watch the video.
Just to set up the clip a little bit, I do want to say that the enemy... say the enemy, but the opponent, the opposite position of ours is not, don't have any children. That's an extreme position that most people would never agree with. Most people don't agree with that. What I want to convey is that the opposite position is you can limit your children. Mm-hmm. Because that's actually how the position of what I would argue is biblical and the position of the historic church transformed into the modern day and ended up being completely opposite. The opposite is that you can limit children, which all the assumptions that we just talked about then are assumed in that idea. And it was brought in through the Lambeth Conference in 1928 by the Anglican Church. And their view was not you can just not have children. Their view was you can limit your children. That was how it was first brought in, and it happened very abruptly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's important to understand that. So the clips that we play, these people in general are all for having children, but they still think it's okay to limit them, and that's the issue that actually is completely different than what the Christian position has been.
Well, and even if their position isn't that you limit children, their position is you're somehow limiting children through your child spacing. So it's an even deeper level of deception, because it's we'll have as many children as we can have in the period of fertility that we have as women, but I'm going to determine how far apart those children are spaced.
Right.
Which is limiting children over the life of a woman. It's just done in a very deceptive way.
Yeah. I mean, how many children would have come forth, and again, how many generations within the space of that period, possibly, had it not been done? That's, So let's go ahead and listen to our first clip. This is from Bright Hearth. And again, it sounds very good for a little bit, but then it's got some stuff kind of thrown in there.
I think one of the questions that we ought to be asking, and I think Lexi would agree with me here, is we should be asking, how ought a Christian? What are some practical ways, babe, that we could be thinking about this differently and responding to their all-out assault on population control? Like thinking about number of children that we have. How could we think about family planning differently and all of that side of things? In a peculiarly Christian way, how can we think about those issues? And I know you have some words on family planning.
Yeah.
That might be helpful.
Yeah, so I read a book.
So I want you to notice how they set it up. How can we think of this in a peculiarly, I can't even say it.
Peculiarly.
There you go. Christian way. And this to me is what evangelicalism is plagued with, and the Reformed Church today, because of its influence, is plagued with. This idea that I'm going to be conservatively moderate. So I'll be moderate, but I'll be on the rightest part of the moderate side. And that's the peculiar Christian way of thinking about things. Again, the Christian way about thinking about these things would be, let's go to the Bible and let's see what it says and what does it say throughout church history.
To be generous to the Sauvays, I think their desire is to be fully Christian in their mindset and their practice.
Absolutely.
I think that they are just confused on this issue.
Yes. I think a lot of people are. I think that they view themselves as countering a bad cultural thing.
And they are.
And they are in some ways, but the problem is they're perpetuating it. By not going far enough, you end up perpetuating. All you're doing is you're resetting back to the Lambeth Conference.
Yeah.
That's all you're doing. So, yes, you can get the church to maybe have more kids and be a little bit better, but eventually we're going to get to, where the Lambeth Conference leads, which is sexual revolution, homosexuality, transgenderism, all the stuff that comes with once you let go of the idea that a sexual act needs to be open to God to be creative.
Recently, because I kind of wanted to figure out, you had mentioned to me a couple months ago, I was kind of wishing this would have been the opposite.
Can you pause? Sorry, I know that's... I think it's interesting how she says, I wish it would have been the opposite in setting this up. We started talking about this, but I wish it would have been the opposite.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Is that she's coming into the study of this with a mindset that she doesn't want to let go of. That there is whether she recognizes it or not, there is a deep-seated internal rebellion. And I want family planning to be true. I want it to be the practice of the early church. And it bothers me that is not the case. So I'm still going to justify it.
Yeah.
The rebellion often hides in this way where it's, you go into something, I have an open mind, I want to learn, but you don't really want to learn because you want to hold on to it. So you're not going to have the truth because you're not actually open to the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, learning and affirming are two separate things. When a lot of people say I want to learn, they are actually saying I want to affirm what I believe. And that's a completely different place. And as Americans, we're taught to affirm, not to learn.
Well, and I think, once we get done reading the quotes throughout church history that we're going to do, people need to think about, are they going to submit to that's the Christian position, or are they going to take all of that and see in some way, can I fit it into what I want to believe already and what I want to do already? And frankly, a lot of people in their rebellion are going to try to fit it into what they believe already, or they're going to dismiss it in some way, or they're going to try to reinterpret the quote. It's just going to be something like that to where people just don't want to come to terms with there's one Christian position, not many, on this issue historically. And therefore they're being called to account by it.
And just to show again, the depths of our sin and depravity, as we said, the Sauvays are deeply passionate about taking Christian culture and being faithful and holy. And to us, this seems like one of the most pure positions we can have, right, with children and whatnot. But we're soon going to show that even in that, the sin goes so deep that things that look like purity and holiness and maybe it is, and next to abortion and transgenderism and the sexual revolution, but to God, it's still gross.
Well, we're tricksy little hobbitses, right? So our rebellion in the Reformed world is not going to be, I'm not going to follow God. It's going to be a religious form. We're going to turn it, and this is what happens ultimately, is we're going to turn it into, using contraception is what God would want me to do.
It's wise.
It's responsible.
The word that I hear all the time.
Yeah, responsible and wise, and God's sovereign. If He wants me to have a child, He'll supernaturally give me a child, even though I'm using birth control. And it's this religious sort of I'm just relying on God. I'm really just doing what God wants me to do.
It's really a testing of God. Yeah, that's really what it is. Though.
Well, yeah. I mean, you literally could hold a gun to someone's head and said, if God wants you dead, or if God wants you to remain alive,
right,
He'll supernaturally stop this bullet And it's sort of like, okay, well, I mean, I again, God's expressed will is that you don't murder your babies. He doesn't save them from being murdered in abortion. God allows the devil's world to be the devil's world.
Yeah.
And so that you can't argue from the sovereignty of God. It doesn't work that way.
What did Protestants historically think? Would they have tried to plan their babies? Would they have done child spacing? And you were like, well, no, they just literally accepted them as they came. And that...
Most Christians for most of church history.
Yeah, that kind
All Christian teachers, not all Christians, because there are people who profess, but all Christian teachers for all Christian history, except for the 20th century, have just let God decide how big their family is going to be because they're in submission to God.
And have condemned the other practice.
Yes, it's not just a preference. So in other words, this is why we pointed this out at the beginning. It's not a preference. It's not just like, oh, Christians in history just kind of decided to do this, but you're fine doing your thing too. No, Christians throughout history thought it was murder and it was contrary to God. It was a rebellion against God and that you were going to go to hell for doing it. And that, I know that sounds harsh and crazy to us now, but that is the view. So it cannot be presented as a kind of a preferential thing. It needs to be understood that it's an absolute evil in the mind of church teachers in history.
And just to frame it in ecclesiological terms, if we're looking at what Calvin would say, or I think it was Calvin or Luther would say, the three marks of a true church: the sacraments, the preaching of the word, and church discipline. Church discipline would actually, in this case, in church history, would be excommunication. Like you brought this up at the beginning.
Right.
Withholding communion is excommunication.
Yeah.
This is a side statement, and I won't go any further than this, but I will say the Protestant church would probably write off most churches today that even affirm that they hold those three things and do those three things. Our church discipline today is worthless. Our church discipline today is nothing. It is maybe a verbal slap on the hand, or it's this what's the current term? The winsome, like some winsome. You got to kind of meet them in the middle.
Yeah.
But church discipline,
you got to have people where they're favorable toward their own discipline.
Yeah. So I want to say, like in his statement, that most Christians, and I think the better statement would be all Christian leaders, all pastors, all bishops, Athanasius, all these guys. If there was a layman, if there was a sheep in God's flock who was sinning in this way, and it was found out, there would be church discipline. If they repented, there would be. Now we could agree or disagree on what penance looked like, or what penance is. But they would have to go through steps to show that their repentance was. It was so deep, and invasive. It was something like this, and they do that with other things, not nearly as burdensome, sin wise.
I mean, today by the church, you would be seen as a cult.
Yes,
you would. The church throughout history would be seen as a cult. The church throughout history would be seen as legalistic.
Right.
Overbearing, bad pastors. I mean, all of that sort of thing for exercising such authority. So, but again, this is what makes a true church.
Yeah.
kind of was a shock to me, and it's because now that I know a little bit more about the history of Planned Parenthood, I understand why. It's the waters I'm swimming in.
Yeah.
But I was kind of trying to find a book that would look at it from a Protestant historic perspective and not just like critique just the birth control pill, essentially. Because we read years ago, before we were married, Randy Alcorn's book.
Oh, we were trying to figure it out. We're going to get married.
Yeah.
We're going to be going to the marriage bed, baby.
So
we got to figure this out.
So he has, I know that there's other books that are dedicated more.
You know, his I don't know if you've listened to a few of these or whatever, but his eagerness is a little bit.
Is he?
Yeah.
Eager
I mean,
beaver?
it's funny, but he expresses no lack of
He loves
desire
his wife.
for his
Let's
wife.
put it that way. He loves his wife.
He's allowed to love his wife.
He's allowed to.
Exactly.
Be generous.
He is. It's just a little. It's a little.
I don't need to know his. He can keep that in the bed.
Yeah. They can edit that out if they want.
It makes him relatable.
And I liked it. Okay, keep going. I'm sorry. Because you're looking good, girl. Okay, I'm sorry. Keep going.
There are other books dedicated more to just the historical
Yeah.
perspective, but he touches
Brian
on
Hodges'
a little
book.
bit in this book that's called Children, Blessing or Burden. I highly recommend it. He uses a lot of George Gilder? Am I saying that right?
I believe
George
so.
Gilder and Gary North for this, so it seems like a really
the
solid
author?
resource.
Max Heine.
Yeah, I think he's only written
So
one other book.
M-A-X, and then last name's H-E-I-N-E. Heine.
So I still think it's appropriate for families to use natural means of child
Okay,
spacing.
stop it right there.
Why?
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
all right.
So I still want to hold what I believe.
That's what I'm saying is she went into this saying she wished that this wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So she already had an idea of what she wanted. And that was the end.
Well, I also want to say, I almost think even for people, because they have 5 kids or whatever, and they'll probably have more kids and all that, it may not even be the desire to not have kids. I think so many evangelicals are trained that if you're not in the middle position of any issue, you're extreme.
Right.
So if you hold that birth control or contraception is always wrong, well, you're in those KJV only, fundamentalists, wear a suit all the time, yell at everyone. You're in that category of just, crazy cultist or whatever. I'm a thoughtful, moderate person. So I'm not over in this extreme to where you shouldn't have babies at all. Of course you should have babies. I'm in the middle. And evangelicals are taught the middle position is the Christian position by default.
So this is Hegelianism, right? So
Yeah.
this is the thesis, the antithesis,
Right.
and the syncretism.
Right,
So,
that's the right answer.
And the syncretism is the right answer.
Right.
So if you're on thesis or antithesis, you haven't come to truth yet.
Yeah.
I think that's true maybe for men. I think for women, it's deeper. I think because the woman is the one who is carrying the child, there's a physical and mental toll that she undergoes in the process of bearing children.
Right.
I see this in our church and women that I've talked to, that it requires a sacrifice of you that is very personal. And so women want to believe that child spacing is an option for them because it allows them to be in control of their body.
Yeah.
It allows them to say, and these are things I've heard from women in my own church, well, I need to lose a certain amount of weight before I have the next baby.
Yeah.
Because if I'm at this weight, then it's not going to be healthy for my child. Or when you go in to talk with your midwife or your doctor and they say to you, well, it would be really bad for your body for you to get pregnant again before 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And she brings this up in this podcast. And the metric is constantly shifting. It's always changing.
Right.
But all of it is about, well, I'm being wise with my body because I'm trying to protect myself and my future child. But really, it's a lack of faith.
Yeah, it's kind of the Christian version of my body, my choice type thing, right? It's sort of
the
like
reformed version of that.
Yeah, the reformed version. And again, it's sanctified in the idea, well, I'm doing what's responsible, as April said. I'm doing what's responsible, and therefore that's what God wants me to do. He wants me to do the responsible thing. Again, this is just void of biblical ethics about sexuality. But we're not taught sexual ethics anymore in the church. We weren't. The only sexual ethics you get in the church is don't sleep with your girlfriend, and by sleeping with your girlfriend, I mean don't have sexual intercourse. You pretty much do everything else. Like it's not. There's no extensive understanding of sexuality by the modern church because its worldview in evangelicalism is replaced by largely the cultural worldview, which means that its teleology of the sexual act has been replaced by our culture's teleology, which is why the teleology of any given Christian is exactly the same as the teleology of any given atheist in our culture. It's the same thing because the worldview of Christianity was replaced, and we just have the husk of, do you believe the Trinity? Do you believe in salvation by grace? Do you believe Jesus' bodily resurrection? So you've got the essentials kind of as the husk, but the actual worldview, well, that divides, so we won't really talk about that. And this is what you get as a result.
Well, to April's point, I mean, the curse of Genesis 3 on the woman is a serious, scary thing. when we read the curse that she will bear children in pain, a woman doesn't fully understand the curse until she's pregnant and gives birth.
I'm gonna actually argue that that's not what that passage says.
What do you mean?
So although it is true, it is true that women give birth in pain.
I will attest to that.
What that passage is, the actual curse part is actually that it's going to be difficult for her to give birth.
Sure. Okay.
And I mean, I would argue because it's corresponding to their sin or whatever, but that's why then in Genesis you see difficulty of people having children, and they have to pray for it, and God will then give them children even in difficulties and all that sort of thing. But the idea is that the world will not be to where she can just have children. The world will actually be set against her having children, and she's going to have to fight to have them, is the idea.
Well, let me expand pain to children dying, right? So
right.
You're right. So if the pain is both, well, I will say physical labor or raising the child in the womb, and then also one being able to have children, period, or being able to keep the children, like death and the curse of the land and whatnot. It's a serious thing, right? When we read it, it doesn't come up. We don't really understand the weight of the curse. Just like we don't even understand the weight of the curse of death until we are on our deathbed, or some of us don't even get that privilege that we're dead before we know it. But it's a scary thing, and to April's point, there is something deeper for a woman that she's thinking about. For the man, it's like for the man, for what we're trying to do is we're giving up ourselves, right? We're actually being. We see those memes all the time where like the kid is like a puzzle. And then you look at the father, and all his pieces are taken out.
Oh
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So like you're literally losing yourself. That's a scary thing for the man, because
and it's financial for men. They have to think about the financial aspect more than women do.
The financial aspect, but especially as like men grow older, if you have sons, when they grow older, you literally have to like sacrifice yourself so that your image that you've created is.
Yeah.
Hopefully better. Right?
I think it's important for us to realize there are when people argue for this subject morally, and you'll see this in other moral issues as well, but this one, I think you see it just more clearly, is typically they're arguing the reasons why they do something, not why it's okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the same thing in the abortion argument. Everyone can sympathize and understand why you might do something. I understand why, if your husband is, verbally cursing you out or whatever, I understand why you killed him. It doesn't make it okay that you did. Like, I get it. Like, I understand, like, why people do certain things. There are lots of reasons why we respond the way we do. Yeah. The issue is that because we're fallen, we don't respond in righteous ways. We respond in wicked ways, and those wicked ways are still wicked, even if you had a good reason. Yeah. And that to me that wipes out like 99% of the objections that I get back, which is about whether it be scares of health, scares of financial scares, emotional burdens, all that sort of thing. All that wipes out all of those, because those are just reasons why I understand why you would do this thing. But it doesn't tell me why it's justified morally and it's okay.
There's also I feel like when I get into these conversations with women on this subject, there's a view of God that is also in error. It's that not that God is a loving father who wants to give you a blessing. It's God is dictator over my life and wants to burden me.
He made me a slave to my husband, is making me a slave to my children.
There's a lack of understanding that God's timing is not only perfect, but it is for your good. Yeah. And that he loves you and cares for you. And if you get pregnant 6 weeks after just having a child, it's for your good. It's a blessing.
Well, Allison would often talk about it takes the stress off of you playing God and trying to figure out when you should have a kid, when you shouldn't, when you should do this or when. And Allison just gave it up to God and was just like, okay, well, God probably knows better than I do.
Probably.
Yeah, I'm just saying, maybe.
I mean, the Bible says, let's give the Bible a chance to prove itself.
All right, back to the video.
I mean, not child spacing, but planning children in general.
Yeah, understand for a
Sorry,
woman and a
pause
man
it
to
real
work
quick.
together to understand.
I also wanted to point out,
2 seconds.
I don't think it was even
in.
a sentence there.
I also wanted to point out, and this is something everybody does, that it started off with what did the Puritans, she said Protestants believe, and then Brian Souvet said, well, no, actually this was most of church history believed that you have as many kids as God gives you. And then there is a jump to, well, but I think,
Yeah.
and I'm like, whoa, hold on,
Without knowing their reasoning or what they said. Yeah.
like, why do we do that? What?
Because we're
Because
defensive.
we're hiding the rebellion.
We're defensive. We immediately see an opposite thing that's said, and we're like, "Well, nope, I got to protect my area because I don't want that to be true." And so I'm going to immediately
Which
say,
she
"But I
admitted.
think this."
Yes.
And
So is this like post-mill? Is this like, like we'll say, well, the Protestants and the Reformation said this, the early church, but that was the church in the infancy. Now there's
I don't
way
know
more.
because they
Well, it's
are
funny because
they are post-mill.
Yeah, most post mills in the early 20th century were arguing that it would be what would bring about the post millennium is people got rid of birth control because of all the Christians that you would have everywhere. So it was this is anti post mill.
Well, did they believe that with the circadian I'll just call it circadian rhythm?
Yeah, all around. Yeah, all around. When
That's for sleep.
I know.
when earlier Christians talk about
It was called the rhythm method. They didn't call it natural family planning. They
Yeah.
called it the rhythm method in church history.
right, and it was when they talk about contraception. It's they don't use the term contraception. They talk about the practices.
Yeah.
And so one of the practices is that.
Is that.
And then there's other practices too, but it's all thrown in because it's under the category of trying to prevent this child from existing.
Let's remember, and I'll say this and I'll be done. I think it's a good lesson in saying when we're dealing with beliefs that we're trying to investigate, like how we're living and what's the Christian way to live, and we look at what the church is doing. I think we need to right there. We know what we believe, right? Because that's what we're investigating. We need to put that aside and actually look into what the church has actually said. And therefore, when I say the church, I mean what the Holy Spirit has guided the church in history through the Word to what God is actually telling us how to live.
Well, yeah, we need to be Augustinian in understanding that we're fallen, including noetic effects. Whereas I feel like everyone becomes Pelagian, and they assume rather that they're right, rather than assume, oh, I have a sin nature that's been a rebellion against God, and I agree with my culture for the most part on this issue. I should assume that I'm wrong, and that I actually am doing something evil because that's what my flesh would want to do. Instead, there seems to be a Pelagian sort of like, well, I'm assuming I'm right. And maybe I'll incorporate something that the church has in the past, but for the most part, I'm right, and they're probably wrong if they disagree with me.
And how God made a woman's fertility
Correct.
to work.
Yeah.
And then to be wise in the way that
Okay.
they plan
Okay.
Wow.
to provide for health of mom,
Yes.
financial provision for family, all of that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay, I find it fascinating that the way we know what God's will is, be fruitful and multiply. God expressed it explicitly. We're not guessing at it. So that means when he made them male and female, it was to be fruitful and multiply, which means when he made the woman, it was to be fruitful and multiply, which means when he made her rhythm, it was for her to figure out to be fruitful and multiply, not be the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And yet in our fallenness, what do people do? They use the rhythm of the woman to be the opposite, to go against being fruitful and multiplying. So it's very clear then from God's expressed will that we are going against it.
That's why this is a deeper sin issue for women, because women are the ones who understand this rhythm the most, who understand when are the prime times for fertility the most, and then who abuse that. with or without the consent or knowledge of their husbands.
Yes.
And that's evil.
Yeah, I've seen men
That's
who
evil.
they've come to the right of the issue, but the women, because men don't know enough about it, will play that game.
Yes.
Sure,
Oh
yeah.
no, I have a headache tonight.
Yeah.
I can't.
Or throw the wrapper in the garbage on the top so that he sees the menstrual wrapper or whatever and it's like, not to get explicit, but you know what I mean. There are those tricks
Sure.
that people do because they ultimately, women know better. So even if the man comes to the right, the woman down deep doesn't really want to do that from whatever fear she has or selfishness or whatever it may be.
The woman really, it comes down to autonomy. She does not want to give her body to God.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Well, in
Whenever-
those cases, not to her husband either.
or to her husband. And this is why you hear the health arguments all the time. It's why you hear the weight arguments, all the child spacing arguments. It's the woman does not want to submit her body.
Yeah.
The end.
Well, and I think we don't want to submit our lives to God because it could be that you die in childbirth. Rachel died, and this is why Genesis, I think, has the example of Rachel. Rachel dies in giving birth to Benjamin. She dies. And yet throughout the book, it's been arguing that it's God's will that children be born, and it's clearly God's will that Benjamin is born. In fact, God gives Benjamin to Rachel. So for a fact it's his will, and it's been his will to make not only Benjamin, but a tribe out of Benjamin. So it was God's will for her to die. Now, if she were a modern woman, she'd be like, well, no, death is not on the table. God's not going to kill me. I'm not going to do that if God's going to kill me. And it's this misunderstanding that, look, we are sacrificing ourselves for our children. That's the whole point. If Rachel had been selfish and been like, I know for a fact, it's not that I even have health issues. I know for a fact I'm going to die in childbirth, and therefore I'm not going to have this baby. There wipes out the entire tribe of Benjamin, not just throughout the Bible, but even now, how many millions and tens of millions of people have come forth from Benjamin? It wipes out the Apostle Paul. There's no Apostle Paul now. Like, it wipes out all these people. So it may be that God does actually claim our lives. And wouldn't it be better that you actually die while giving birth to a child and generations of people rather than, choking on like a bonbon or something? I mean, not that anybody chokes on a bonbon.
That's what all we're eating at home.
I don't know if half our audience even know what a bonbon
But
is.
you know what my point, or even dying like in a car wreck or something. Like you're dying doing the most important thing that your biological system was created, you as a female, to do.
Well, and since we're talking about church history, the irony in this is that all through church history, they did not hold the position that's held today, and childbirth was more risky for them.
More people died,
much
more
more
women
risky
died
for them.
Yeah.
They knew that being pregnant and giving birth, there was a high likelihood that either the mom or the baby was going to die.
Yeah.
And yet they still submitted to it. Today, we have so many medical marvels, praise God, and we are more fearful.
Yeah. Well, how men want to have a good death, honorable death. And that's usually, you got to go to some famous battle. You don't want to.
Right.
And men don't, you go to war, you don't want to die because your buddy dropped a hand
throw
grenade.
yourself in front of your wife.
You don't want to die because your buddy dropped a hand grenade. You want to
Right.
be the guy that jumps on the enemy's hand grenade and saves everybody.
Right.
Women used to see themselves, the glorious way to die would be by having children.
Yeah.
That's like, for the woman, that's like the warrior's death. And our culture today, men are afraid, no man wants to go to war anymore. They either want to do a Spartan race or anything like that, like a pretend war, but they don't want to actually go to real war. Because
Play football or something.
Yeah, and same with the women. Women, because the culture has taught them that, well, it's like you said, it's risky, it's dangerous. Why would you do that? And then also, by the way,
safe birth or no birth.
Yeah, safe birth or no birth. Oh, and also, that's not a glorious way to die. That's actually a putrid, disgusting, worthless way to die.
Well, I think it is true, and obviously this could be a whole nother podcast, but I do think that we're afraid to die because our minds are not on the things above, but on the things below.
Right. We don't believe.
And we are so materialistic. We are so attached to this world that it is unthinkable and irresponsible for anyone to suggest that we should still risk our lives to have children.
Because look at all the kids that would be left behind. And, if the mother is not there, what's going to happen to those children? And that's why I say that in all of these arguments, there's a lack of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know deep down, I know what obedience would be, but I don't know if I can trust God in that.
It's us playing God again.
Yeah.
It's the same story over and over again. I don't trust God with my life, so I have to play God.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I wanted to say with that statement, when we're looking at nature as this telling us what we ought to do, epistemologically is turned upside down to how we understand reality.
Yeah.
If we take cues of nature and then decide, well, nature must be telling, God must be telling me this through nature. It would be equivalent to like if I went up to a stoplight and I saw a red light and I was like, well, that's just to tell me that there's probably other cars coming, but I'm still going to run through it. Like,
yeah.
No, it's not. Like, you're supposed to stop.
Well, and let me solidify that. God actually has a command for you not to have sex during your menstrual period, which is one of the hardest times to actually have a child. And so we know then
it's gross. That's all.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Well, that's the thing. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but it's in Leviticus 18 to where it's a crime that brings about exile and death.
Yeah.
And in chapter 18 and in chapter 20, getting blood on you from having sex with your wife, that's just a ritual issue, and you can be clean in like a day or a couple days or whatever. It's fine. But you purposely partaking in that period. So in other words, using a time period that God has deemed less likely for you to get pregnant to have sex with your wife is viewed as evil enough for you to actually be executed for it or exiled from the land. Which goes to show you that if we then take this idea that God has set these times for us so that we know when not to have sex, so that we can go ahead and avoid children, is not the trajectory of the Bible. That's not what the Bible is arguing.
Well, and notice how he said less likely. It is actually possible to get pregnant when you are in your period.
Right.
It is less likely. So the argument can't then be, well, we're using natural family planning, but it's not impossible.
Right.
It's less likely
Yeah.
because you are doing that intentionally.
Yeah. I mean, you can get your tubes tied and some of those guys end up having children, but it's not likely that
your husband can have a vasectomy and you can still have it miraculously heal and get pregnant.
Yeah.
That's not obedience.
Yeah.
Going back to Romans 1, just to warn Christians, and a lot of us think, well, because I'm a Christian, I'm not in danger of this admonition or warning that Paul talks about in Romans 1. But why did the Gentiles or the wicked, those who are wicked, why did they turn to idols, turn to what is created rather than worshiping the Creator? Because they weren't thankful, right? There's this idea of they weren't thankful, right? That's literally what Paul says. Not giving thankfulness to God, they turned from the Creator and went to what is created, and God gave them over to a debased mind. I almost sense like a unthankfulness. Like if the biological clock is not for us to use in a particular way, which is to advance life, but now to restrict it, that's not thankfulness. That's actually turning to what is created and using that against God.
Yeah.
That leads to further, and
then arguing that you're being responsible by doing it.
Yeah, I think you're being responsible. warning.
What?
That leads probably to other things you're going to do. That you're going to turn to what is created rather than being thankful and worshiping the Creator, right? And it's like it might be baby steps. And I'm not saying look, the Suveys are like a baby steps down to apostasy or something. But I think for Christians, we need to be sure and say, well, I need to use everything God has given me for His purposes.
Well, this is the problem with the moderate position, is that ultimately it opens the door in saying a sexual act can be used in a way that is not open toward God. But at that point, then, as soon as you accept that premise, then you start having to ask, then why isn't this sexual act okay? Mm-hmm. Why isn't that sexual act okay?
Then why isn't
homosexuality okay?
Yeah, why does Leviticus condemn all of these non-procreative acts.
Right. What is wrong with them? If you're just going to do it for an act, but your general relationship will be about having kids, well, why aren't those things okay for just specific acts or whatever? And so this is the problem, is that ultimately this moderate road, although they may personally not go there, will eventually lead that way. And that's what it does with the culture. I'm not just guessing. That's what it does with our culture. This open door leads eventually into churches today being like, homosexuality is okay, and transgender, it leads to that sort of thing, or it can, at least. It allows for it, because the logical conclusion is if a sexual act does not need to be procreative, then you have to start asking then what is the essential component of it. And if it's things like pleasure, if it's intimacy or pleasure, I mean, there are homosexuals who are intimate and have pleasure. What's the difference? And you might say, well, marriage between a man and a woman. Okay, well then, why does the Bible condemn certain acts that are done between men and women who are married? Why is Onan killed? He's married to her.
That was just the specific thing.
Right. That was just the lever of marriage. We'll talk about that as well, that whole objection or whatever. But you see what it is. The reason why the moderate position is not somehow opposite of the extreme position of you can, not have children at all, because eventually it will lead there. So it's either you accept the Christian teleology or you accept the postmodern teleology, or I would say the world's teleology from the beginning of time, but you can't compromise them. There's no Calvinism, right? you can't put the two together. It's one or the other. Either the sexual act needs to be open to God for procreation, or you don't have to. That's it.
And just to be like, I kind of butchered Romans 1:21, but just to be clear, like, okay, so for men of unrighteousness, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. And I would argue not using biologically what he's given us for his purposes is not honoring him. It's honoring yourself. Or give thanks to him. They became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And now claiming to be wise, which is, we're about to hear that, I think, right? That would be wisdom.
There you go.
They became fools. Now, am I like, as Christians, are we immune to this? Are we immune to becoming fools even in Christ? I would say, well, no, because in our sin, we can actually not give thanks to God, and for a time, God can give us over to something until we repent. Right? Kansas Door talk about that, but we got to be careful. It's got to be a warning for us to not be quick, and to doing what we think is right. And we can actually biologically make arguments that are right or whatever, and ignore, like what we just talked about, Leviticus, clear statements of what our sexuality is for and its purposes, and then expand that to what our body does biologically. So if I now understand what my body's doing biologically, I attach that to what God has commanded me to do in Leviticus and Genesis, then I know what it's for, and I'm going to honor God. I'm going to give thanks to Him by doing what I'm supposed to do.
Well, we make this argument all the time with gender, right? So like a woman, the reason why the woman's in the role she's in is not just God, flipped a coin. I mean, he made her for that role. Well, if you are ever confused, I wonder if I should let the sex I'm involved in actually have a procreative purpose. It's like, well, what's the result if you don't do anything to obstruct it? Well, the result is that it'll be open toward having a child. So then God made you for that purpose, and sex for that purpose, so that it's not to be obstructed, in the same way that God made a woman a particular way for her to be in her role, and a man a particular way for him to be in his role.
This is going to be a really weird analogy, so cut me off if this totally doesn't make any sense. It's just me thinking out loud. If the woman's womb is kind of like a small Eden, and Eden is a foreshadowing of what's to come in the new heaven and new earth. And you have this theology that says to you that Eden can be closed sometimes. Okay? Like, I'm sorry you come up to the gate at Eden. I'm sorry, but today is our hours of operation have changed. You're not allowed into Eden. Where are you then? You're out in the wilderness. You're not actually a part of creation. You're not participating in creation. you are not in the garden anymore.
Yeah.
You are just outside of the garden. And if you're talking about that foreshadowing of the new heaven and new earth, then where are you? If you're not in the new heaven and new earth, where are you? So the language that Drake talked about, creation versus destruction, are you participating in creation, or are you being an opponent? Are you being a destroyer?
Yeah. We only like colorful typology when we apply it to, going to bars or.
Well, I think okay. I think what April said is new. The statement for a lot of people is new. What do you mean my womb is like Eden? Because you and I both nodded, so we obviously agree with that.
It's the place that God does creation now.
Yeah, I think, man, women, if you can look at your womb like that, I don't know, that might change the way. That right there might change a lot of women's minds and go, okay,
don't close Eden.
Don't close, right?
Yeah, don't
Well,
do
and
that.
I think that's why women are sacred. When you cut that off from a woman, it cuts off her sanctification. It cuts off who she is and her identity.
Yeah.
Like God has a normal time when he wants the woman to transition, but he does that by not
But
creating
he-
any more himself.
He
does
that.
it.
He chooses
Correct.
when the time is. She
And-
doesn't flip a switch.
No, and I think prematurely when you do that to women, you basically tell them they're something other than what God made them to be. And I think it is destructive toward her. She is sacred because she is Eden. She is the only place that is left that God still creates human life. And so he perpetuates Eden through her. And so it's really, I just think our view of women is lesser because we don't understand that. And even women in their own self-worth, I think, is lesser because they don't understand that.
And closing off the womb is actually treating the woman like she's a man.
Yeah.
Because men don't have wombs. Newsflash.
Yeah.
They are not the place that God is creating in. They are used to create life, but they are not that place. So to close that is like, I'm sorry, but how is it any different than two men having sex? It's not different.
It's basically like saying you're going to be a man for 2 months or 6 months or whatever, and
so that I can have my pleasure without any of the responsibility.
That
is what it is.
That's
It's
a great
crass,
point.
but it is.
you're going to be a prostitute for about 6 months.
Yep. That's good.
And so to try to sanctify that religious language like it's wise and it's responsible and we're relying on God, and it's like these are just words. They're not biblically faithful.
Yeah.
Now, just so you know, if you are using some sort of a predictive monitor of sorts, it's not going to work long term. You really have to be observing your own body temperatures. You have to be charting, essentially. So if you get pregnant unexpectedly because you start using those things, I didn't tell you to do that. I told you to start charting.
You're welcome.
Well, hold on,
See,
man.
even that.
How complicated is this? Like, sin is complicated, right?
Well, if God actually
complicated.
to go back to what they were saying that God made our bodies so we could do this. What woman in history would be able to I got to take my temperature and monitor and chart, and it's like, okay, then why didn't God provide all that technology and stuff like back then? It's like, yeah, women still try to predict it back then. It's still something that women try to do, but it's not all that, and they're usually wrong.
What's worse is that she's saying this, and if you get pregnant because you didn't do this correctly, that's not my fault, because children are a burden. So, that's not on me. That's on you.
Right.
Read the
The
first
assumption
sentence.
is there, and I'm sure if you said that, she'd be like, "Oh no,
Well,
children are not a burden."
He tried to counter that and say, congratulations,
Right.
Because
he even noticed it.
he sees that there is sin in that thinking.
Right. And that's unfortunate, but it's we need to be aware. These are the assumptions to where, look, even when I've ever argued this issue with people and they've come to conclude, yeah, that must be true, you can kind of see it in people's face to where they don't want it to be true.
Mm-hmm. Or they'll tell you they don't want it to be true.
Yeah, and then some people are like, I see what you're saying. I can't argue against it, but I just don't want to do that. They'll just flat out say, I just don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Bring the unexpected. Well, you're welcome.
Yes. No, I'm
We
just
helped.
saying, like, a lot of people don't know that. We didn't know that because I didn't know enough about this. So we didn't know that.
Yeah.
So, anyways, planning, though, historically was not something Christians did. They literally.
Okay.
So it's just like,
Can we investigate
it's
why
like-
that's true?
but it's fascinating that
Because
it's
they didn't
sort
have
of
the
like
technology. That's
they-
what she's arguing.
they didn't. No. I think that they're saying that they just received what God had for them. We're not going to do that because we think it's perfectly okay. But historically, yeah, Christians didn't do that. And it's like, okay, again, like your
Why?
question, why is that?
Well, I think it's because they wouldn't been able to know. Like Christians just embraced it because they didn't have the
Because
means.
they were ignorant.
Well,
because we
historically, that's not
were-
true, though. I mean, I don't know how ignorant they are of history, but historically, that's not true.
Well, because they're not going to say it's. They're not saying it's sin.
Right.
So the only other conclusion I can come up with that is somewhat coherent would be that Christians did it because they couldn't figure that out. I mean, they
weren't
knew the
as smart
cycles,
as us.
See,
but they just didn't have all that tech to figure it out.
I almost get a hint, and maybe I didn't listen to it fully, or I forget what they say. I almost got a hint of Christians had more faith than we did back then.
Well, that's true. I would say that's true.
Christians were more committed to Jesus back then than we
I would
are.
say in a lot of ways that's true.
I think it's
Yeah.
not only true, but
I
it
would say
almost
that's true.
it's almost in their assumptions.
I don't know that.
Where Christians were more faithful back then, and they were just all about God back then. Whereas now we realize, we kind of need some of our lives for ourselves.
But that's why all of this is speculation because they didn't give us a why.
Yeah.
They didn't actually. They just made the jump. They jumped the
Well,
shark.
because in our
and they didn't
Christian
tell us
in our
why.
Christian context, that nobody needs to give a why, right? Everybody's just like, oh yeah, of course that's
because
true.
it's what you think.
Well, I'm going
Right.
to assume that as Brian being a pastor, I'm going to assume that there is no if their goal in this podcast, this is so like contradictory. If their goal in the podcast is to bring holiness, holy living in all the spaces of the home, and then they go except for this part because they're so faithful back here, and you know what? Just like the heroin addict needs what's the drug, metrodone or whatever it is.
I've never taken it.
Okay. Well, heroin addicts, you can't just get off of heroin. You need like
Right,
a
it's-
drug, right?
yeah.
To slowly get yourself off. Well, is that where we are? Is that I have a hard time seeing a pastor saying, "Come to the halfway house with us, and we can detox you off of this, death cult that you're in." And I'll give you the halfway measures of being in the death cult, so I can eventually bring you out to being as faithful as the old church. Like what?
I almost feel. I mean,
You
again,
can't be doing that.
not to say that Brian is Korah, but it's almost this Korah-esque type thing of like, well, the people are. This will make you holy enough. You don't need to go further like the crazies do or something in the past. And I know he wouldn't say the crazies, but
or
ultimately,
the crazies sitting here.
yeah. But it does seem to be sort of like, again, why are you different than the Christians in the past?
That is the question.
Like why?
What changed?
What? Yeah. What is the change? And it better be a really, really, really
But
good,
she
solid
acknow-
biblical
she
reason.
acknowledges that the change came with Margaret Sanger. She acknowledges the
Yeah.
roots of it.
Right.
So
But why-
that's why I say
Yeah,
there's
why would-
no.
It's almost like saying, and Sanger was kind of right.
Well, okay, I haven't listened to the.
So maybe we.
So
should
maybe
keep-
they do give
Alright.
a good reason.
No.
Spoiler alert.
Accepted babies as they came. And there's a lot of evidence from scripture that shows that the idea of family planning now came from Planned Parenthood, which I despise.
So I just want to point out that, and this is kind of went out of her mouth, and there's plenty of evidence in Scripture that they did that. So we're no longer even just talking about historical teachers and people. We're talking about even biblical people. So people in the Bible did it.
Well,
again, why are you different
Was that
than
prescriptive
people
or
in the
descriptive?
Bible?
Though, right? So,
Well, yeah, there you go.
There you-
And I would say Genesis 1, it's
I mean-
prescriptive.
Boy, am I glad that King David was born because he was not the oldest
Right.
son. So
Yeah.
I'm really glad that he existed.
I mean, they had enough kids as it was.
they didn't have
were-
thermometers back then. So,
All right.
So I kind
Yeah.
of just don't like it because of that.
Yeah.
But so there's
I
basically
kind of just don't like
I
it
kind of
because it's associated with someone who is fully affiliated and aligned with Satan.
So
and
she-
Yeah, so
killing
why?
babies.
But why was
She
it affiliated with that? Why?
She clearly thinks it would be a root fallacy or something to say, oh, well, this thing originated Margaret Sanger. But she clearly is saying, but Margaret Sanger was right about it. I just don't like it because it was Margaret Sanger who said it. And it's sort of like, but Margaret
man.
Sanger said it because she had a completely different worldview and teleology of the sexual act.
But I can redeem this horrible satanic practice.
Well, no,
Right.
the axiom is that Margaret Sanger took something that was somehow good.
Right. She just misused
She
it.
just misused it.
But
Yeah,
I.
and so they're
but
gonna
at that
redeem
point, you would
it.
even have to ask,
They're gonna
why
redeem
did
it.
Margaret Sanger? How is it a misuse by Margaret Sanger?
How is
I
it a
mean,
misuse? Right.
She's
But
using
she
it.
but it's not a misuse because she invented it. She didn't invent the
Well,
sin, but she turned this into a business. So it
Yeah.
wasn't like, the church was doing this and now she misused it.
Right.
She's the one that pushed this. She's the one who perpetuated this.
Well, and what needs to be understood, and this is where I'll promote this book. If you ever read this book, it's called Godly Seed. It's
Who's it by?
It's by Alan Carlson, who's a Lutheran historian, but he basically goes through and talks about how Sanger didn't just stay in her lane and area. Her goal was to convince preachers to push her message, and so she has a direct influence not just on secular culture, but on the modern church's view of sexuality and birth control. And originally, she had a major influence on the church's view of abortion.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize that when Roe versus Wade was passed, most evangelicals they celebrated.
Right.
They thought it was great, which is horrific. But that's how brainwashed people were. And then you had people like, Billy Graham come along and, now I'm going to forget the name, but some evangelical leaders like John Warwick Montgomery argue that abortion and birth control should be separated. So they argue birth control is okay, but abortion's murder. And that's where you get the new argument as to why abortion is wrong. It's because it's murder of an existing human.
Yeah.
But that is not historically the Christian argument against abortion. The Christian argument against abortion is that it's anti-creational and God wants us to have children, which is also argues against birth control.
That's also not the biblical definition of murder.
Right.
I mean, if you look at even how Christ unpacks that later,
Yeah.
it's not just, the unlawful killing of an existing human being.
Right.
There's a spirit of murder that is deeper than that.
Well, and I think that if it was the strict definition of murder, God would have a lot to answer for because he actually executes people for things that are not strictly murder in our view, that he considers murder in the Bible. And according to the lex talionis, the law of reciprocation, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, you can't take an eye for a life. Or you can't take a life for an eye. Like it's got to be commensurate with the crime. So if God takes a life for things that are not strictly murder, like you sleeping with your wife in her menstrual period, then
There's a justice.
guess what God thinks about it? Yeah. And it's not quite the same thing that you think about it.
Right. I want to like the axiom here. Going back to the axiom. This is not the planning. This family planning idea is not like the money changers in the temple. So Christ goes and clears the money changers in the temple because they've turned the house of God into a den of thieves. But the selling of, but you needed sacrifices.
yeah,
right?
it's not just wrong place, wrong time.
It's not just right.
Right.
It's like there's something axiomatically true about what they were selling and what the people were bringing for sacrifices. There's no right way to family plan. This isn't Christ coming in and kicking the money changers out, but there is a right way to get a sacrifice and all that.
Right.
There is no right way to family plan.
Yeah.
Is ultimately what I would like to just push against what they're saying here, or I guess we're inferring that they're implying that there's some fundamental yes to family planning, and that Margaret Sanger just went like the money changers into the temple.
Right. She's the extreme on the other side.
Yeah.
We're moderate with it.
Seasons of Planned Parenthood's existence, basically.
Yeah.
They
Three
first,
models.
Yes, 3 models. That's a good way to put it. They started out with the whole eugenics.
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely wicked.
And they realized that's not going to work for the average person. It is too wicked. It's
The
not going to
Nazis
work.
learned
It didn't
eugenics
catch on
from
as
Margaret
widely.
Sanger.
The second.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize it's
Yep.
from Americans.
It's from Americans, not from.
I mean, you can root it in Nietzsche or
Well,
whatever,
yeah.
but ultimately it
started the
is
practice.
Americans that actually were doing it, and I would say just as horrific as things that were done to Jews, but it was all quiet, hush hush
Yep.
stuff or whatever.
The second thing they tried to do was, okay, well, let's go at this from a little bit of a nicer angle. Let's help you plan your family. We're pro-family. We're just going to plan the family for you, and we're going to give you these options for when that's going outside of your planned family ideals.
Yeah.
That is
What?
literally when the idea
Hold
of
on.
family planning came into place.
Yeah, that
What did you? Oh,
Like, she recognizes this. She recognizes that this is a problem.
But I think that she almost is arguing
yeah.
again what we were talking about before, whereas you just don't want this organization influencing your decision because that's your decision to make. Doesn't it sound like that a little
Well,
bit?
it sounds like if my ideals would be using. I'm saying me as like if I was a female or something, but using my biological clock as the determiner of when we're gonna have a family, and then I have some other voice come out and say, "Hey, we'll actually enhance your ability to plan a family by giving you these other things," then that's bad.
Yeah.
Is that what she's saying?
I think so. And she's just saying, you know, you as Drake, Kylie, should be able to get pregnant whenever.
Right. But what if my
Well, that's
ideals?
where, I mean,
what if they
you
line
say
up with
that,
my
You
ideals?
say that jokingly, but that's actually where it's
Well, that's
going.
where it goes.
Well, yeah.
That's where it goes.
Yeah,
That's
here it is.
where
It does.
logically goes.
Well, because ultimately, look, this is fundamentally rooted in individualism and the autonomy of humanism, of secular humanism, and so that is the religion of our culture, which is why it cannot be blended with Christianity. They are two opposing religions. That religion is specifically the exact opposite. It's not just another religion like Hinduism.
Right.
It's the exact opposite, and in many ways constructed to be the exact opposite of Christianity.
Well, what if my ideals line up with what Planned Parenthood is?
You should ask yourself why.
Like, okay, again, if we're going to separate abortion and contraception, if Planned Parenthood is just saying, I can give you better means to restrict,
To do what you want, yeah.
to do what your ideals are already telling you want.
Yeah.
What's wrong? What is? And maybe they answer that.
I mean,
biblically,
ultimately,
that's-
they weren't really just doing that. They were also trying to convince people not to have children because they were neo-Malthusian.
yeah, sure, I get that, but I want to know why if Planned Parenthood, if Margaret Sanger, because Satan does this, right? Satan will actually give you something that is reasonable first,
Right.
and then destroy you.
Right.
So if the reasonable thing comes first, and it's like, yeah, that aligns with my ideals, please, and maybe they will do this. Explain why Planned Parenthood's invasion in my ideals is bad.
Yeah. Well, it would just be from, like we talked before, it's just these people imposing themselves. Now, it's not actually...
It's my body, my choice.
It's not bad
That's
as
really-
if you
it is
decide,
that.
oh, sure, I'll take your help. So there's nothing bad about it. And so
It goes like the intuition argument.
she's associating Margaret Sanger with, I think, abortion.
Well, that's the end result, though. But this is like,
Right. But that's why she's saying, oh, I don't like it because it's Planned Parenthood, which, by the way, it was originally called the American Birth Control League. That's what's actually about birth control. Margaret Sanger wasn't really that much about abortion as much. She was a little bit, but it was more about birth control.
yeah,
Because she realized, I'm going to wipe out all these degenerates
Right.
and reduce population through birth control. But
maybe
yeah,
that's
but
why
that's
it's bad.
it has an ick factor for modern evangelicals and reform people, but it's not really a solid moral position as to
no, it's
why do you have an ick factor that birth control came from. Margaret Sanger probably also believed that the earth went around the sun. And maybe she taught other people that as well. I don't have an ick factor about it. I think the ick factor is birth control is part of that whole thing, and there's something wrong with it, and down deep we know it.
Phraseology or
Yes,
phrasing.
correct. Before that, the average human being and the average Christian would have not thought of planning their children. after that, we have the modern, very radical view of Planned Parenthood now.
There's that radical idea.
Abortion,
It's radical.
Women's
control.
rights, correct. Yeah.
Everybody should be on the pill. We should be treating fertility as a problem to be solved. They're, just foaming at the mouth to
Yeah.
figure out how to make men infertile with a pill.
Yeah.
With a men's
Ugh.
pill. They're going to do all of that. It's going to be on the market soon. Just trust us. It's going to be on the market soon.
Yeah.
They'll figure it out.
So there you go right there with it's the extreme. Everybody should be on the pill. Everybody should be doing this and that. That's not really it really is not the argument of the world. The world's argument is, if you so choose, according to your preferences, your religion, your ideals, you become God and decide how you want to use sexuality. And no one should tell you what to do. That's the opposite idea. Not everybody should do what we're doing. Everybody should be on the pill. Nobody should have children. Da da da. No one's arguing that.
There are people like that, but they're typically not
Right.
Christians.
That's not the main. That's never been the main argument. And I don't think even Sanger was arguing that. She was just arguing, don't have as many children and don't let degenerates have children, and they should people of other races don't let them have children, that sort of thing. But she was still saying people could have kids. It really comes down to the sexual revolution is you can use sex the way that you want to, because we don't really don't know if there's a God at all, and if he does exist, he's all about love, and these religions aren't going to tell us what he wants and what his will is for it. So you decide that. That's the opposite view, and that's the view I'm getting from them.
I find it fascinating that the basis of the argument, or the I guess, describing the two sides. The Christian side she describes as what she doesn't believe, which is the church history understanding of having children, just having kids as God allows it, and then Planned Parenthood. Their version of family planning wasn't even if it was a chess match, that wasn't the black side. They're using the ancient church's argument against the Planned Parenthood. They didn't even use their own description of family.
But I feel that they all, even with, yes, I think that's true. But then notice what they took. The assumptions were just letting God do it is unwise, irresponsible.
Was that the assumption?
Well, because
that
then
seems to be the assumption.
because it was like, well, I believe in family planning. After talking about the historic position, I believe in family planning because it's wise, it's responsible, it's health wise, all that sort of thing. Which assumes then that those people were not being responsible, or they couldn't be.
So if Christians fully understood the biblical right way to plan a family, then Planned Parenthood would never have been so influential in changing the culture into, they would say, everybody doing what we're doing.
Yeah,
is that what they're saying?
I think their personal take is, you should decide, but obviously as Christians we're informed by the Bible, so you should try to have children, but you decide when, how many, all that sort of thing, and spacing them and whatnot. And the bad thing about Planned Parenthood was that it just influenced more people to not have kids.
Yeah. Okay.
Period.
Okay.
Which is not really true.
That's not. And again,
the
I think that she just almost like Freudian slipped and used the ancient church argument against Planned Parenthood, because that's the actual one that is under attack, not her version. Her version doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think
it's indefensible against.
I think they think the historic church's version. The assumption seems to be at least that it was the unwise, irresponsible one. Yeah. Again, they probably wouldn't lay that at the feet of people. They probably just think, they either couldn't do it or it wasn't popular, so they just kind of fit in the culture. But now that we're more savvy and more people allow us to do it, we can. I know whatever the assumption is.
We're more advanced because we have access to
in some way. Yeah,
aliens gave us more tech
that these primitive ancient people didn't.
They're dumb.
Yeah, or just the culture. There were stigmas about doing it, maybe, or something, and so they were.
They don't really tell us.
Yeah, no, it's hard to say.
Really
So we have to just kind of guess at their assumptions there, but.
Yeah, I'm trying to psychoanalyze.
Out. And if you think that the destruction of the male testosterone level is bad now, just wait Wait
Well,
until we have
even,
15% of our male population gay, because they're all on some.
Even vasectomies, they haven't. Again, it's not wrong. If you want to go get a vasectomy, it's your freedom. We're not the Pope. We're not going to tell you what to do.
There you go. That's it.
But-
That's
but
it right there.
So
Also,
so
That is
again,
it right there.
I have authority. The church
Wait,
has no authority.
Right.
can we rewind that and play it again?
That's exactly what we've been talking about, though, is that you decide. It's your individual right and freedom to decide what's best for you.
Because we don't want to be like those kooky Roman Catholics who actually support your position.
Well, and that's interesting because that's actually how Sanger convinced so many Protestants, because there was a paranoia about becoming Roman Catholic and a Roman Catholic nation. So she kept arguing that's what Roman Catholics believe.
Yeah.
And they split the Protestants and Roman Catholics that way.
human being and the average Christian would have not thought of planning their children. After that, we have the modern, very radical view of Planned Parenthood now that is just like
abortion as birth
women's
control.
rights. Correct. Yeah.
Everybody should be on the pill. We should be treating fertility as a problem to be solved. They're, just foaming at the mouth to
Yeah.
figure out how to make men infertile with a pill.
Yeah.
With a men's
Ugh.
pill. They're going to do all of that. It's going to be on the market soon. Just trust us. It's going to be on the market soon.
Yeah.
They'll figure it out. And if you think that the destruction of the male testosterone level is bad now, just wait. Wait
Well,
until we have
even,
15% of our male population gay, because they're all on some.
Even vasectomies, they haven't. Again, it's not wrong. If you want to go get a vasectomy, it's your freedom. We're not the Pope. We're not going to tell you what to do.
Oh, man.
but
don't.
But
See, there's a jump there because now it's not even family planning. It's now you can permanently cut off any kind of fertility.
You
and
don't.
that's not
You
wrong.
don't have to have kids at all.
We're not the
It's-
Pope. Why, man? I hear that so often
Again,
these days.
because Reformed people have a low version, a low vision or appreciation of ecclesiology.
Well, yeah. So modern Reform people, and
Yeah,
that's what's
yes.
ironic. The
Reformed
modern
people today.
American, especially in the West, but particularly in America, American Reformed evangelicalism is essentially Anabaptist in its ecclesiology. They like a lot of liturgy and show, but in terms of high church means high authority of the church. It doesn't mean that you
You
go
wear a
around and wear
robe.
robes or whatever. Yeah, and you light candles or whatnot. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with whether the authority you assign to the church. And most people are Anabaptists. They're not magisterial in their understanding of the church. Whereas, you get people like us who are more like magisterial reformers, and we just hear a comment like that, and we're like, yeah, we're not the Pope, but the church has the authority of the Pope.
I am deeply troubled by that statement, and I would say, as a pastor, anyone watching, if you're a Christian, you have a vasectomy, reverse it.
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
in sin. You're in sin.
Yep.
Reverse it.
Yeah.
I have a good doctor that I can recommend for you.
And we're not.
We personally went through this.
Yes,
So
that's.
I mean,
Excellent.
we have a direct understanding of what goes on behind this thought process. And I really do have a good doctor to recommend if you need one.
We should put him up on the screen or something.
Dr. Philip Worthman. He's in Beverly Hills. He's great.
Nice. That's excellent.
You guys went to Beverly Hills? Wow. La-di-da.
I know.
They have good insurance.
Yeah.
Insurance does not pay for vasectomy reversals because our culture loves
yeah.
death.
Yeah, that's
Makes
true.
sense.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you wanted to kill your baby, then fine.
If you want a vasectomy, they actually do pay for it. But if
Oh,
you want a
interesting.
reversal, they do not.
Interesting.
So
And-
you have to pay out of pocket.
Yeah.
And the irony of the statement that she made, coming off as like non-popish, I'm not giving a command. I would never restrict you. Is restricting. Like what she just said is actually authoritarian. It has weight behind it.
Well, because it makes a statement as to whether it's immoral that
That's
needs to be
right.
obeyed. It is an exclusive statement that assumes that it is not a moral issue, and therefore I'm not going to tell you what to do about it.
Yeah.
that technology has not been around long enough for us to know what the effects of it are.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been studied a little bit, and there are negative effects with it.
So it's pragmatic.
So this is pragmatic. And this
The
is, man,
rest of this, I think, is pragmatic.
Okay,
if I remember, the rest of the arguments are pragmatic. I don't know that they go any farther into church history.
Is that the only clip?
Yes,
and not this like
from Bright Hearth. Yes.
I know. Was there another clip? in general by someone else?
Not for church history. No.
Okay.
I don't like. I think it's awesome to have Brian's wife on there to give a female perspective. But when the moral teaching comes out, I want to like. Obviously, Brian agrees with this. Numbers.
Well, he did. I mean, he did correct her when she said, if you want to do that, then do it. And he said, but don't.
Oh, he did? Oh, did he?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
He said, but don't.
Okay. Well, listen to what he said.
Yeah. So I think that's the danger in this is that, and maybe if I would encourage him in some way, I would say, as the pastor, as the head of your household, when you feel like your wife is in error, you need to make that clear.
Yeah, explicit.
For her benefit and for the benefit of your listeners.
But we don't even know why he said but don't, though. Was he saying just but don't, meaning like it'd probably be better in my personal view that you don't? Or was he saying don't because it's morally wrong?
Well, maybe if Brian watches this, he can explain what he meant.
Yeah, it's hard.
And that's why I say, like, I have more freedom in this podcast in saying things than the two of you do, because I know I'm sitting with my elders, and if I misspeak, I say something incorrect, I know that I'm going to be corrected. And maybe I'll look foolish for it, but I would rather be corrected than not.
Yeah.
So I think what we want to do is we want to actually show what the church position is, not just say that this is the church position, but allow you to see it by reading numerous quotes, putting them up on the screen for you to see. So this will be a longer portion of this video, so that you actually have a resource to look at it yourself. But the first thing I want to do is I want to categorize the first group of quotes as what the early church fathers and other people say about the purpose of the sexual act, and then to argue, do they also think that not using it for that purpose is evil, which is what they say about contraception. And that'll be the second group of quotes. And so that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to each take turns reading these quotes to you.
Irenaeus, who is a disciple of Polycarp, a disciple of the Apostle John, stated that God made the male and female for the propagation of the human race. Justin Martyr refers to all Christians when he says, "If we marry, it is only so we may bring up children." Clement of Alexandria tells us that to have coitus other than to procreate children is to do injury to nature. Epiphanius, remarking on a strange Gnostic cult, commented, "They exercise genital acts yet prevent the conceiving of children. Not for the purpose of producing offspring, but for the purpose of satisfying lust are they eager for corruption. To such an extent has the devil deceived these wretched people, that they betray the work of God by perverting it to their own deceits. Moreover, they are so willing to satisfy their carnal desires as to pollute each other with impure seed, by which offspring is not conceived, but by their own will evil desires are satisfied." Cyprian conveys to us that the fathers do not think of procreation as some sort of regrettable, joyless duty. He states rather that it is a source of joy and glory to humans to have children like themselves. Lactantius argues that God does not participate in the sexual act because, quote, "the sexes themselves and the intercourse between them were given to mortals by God for this reason, that every race might be preserved by a succession of offspring." He further remarks that there would be no adulteries, debaucheries, and prostitution of women, if everyone knew that whatever is sought beyond the desire of procreation is condemned by God. Titus of Bostra, in his polemic against the Manichees, described them as those who contemptuously vituperate the procreation of children and desire that there be bodily intercourse without procreation. Cyril of Jerusalem stated, "Let those also be of good cheer who are married and use their marriage properly, who enter marriage lawfully and not out of uncontrolled lust and freedom, to have sex without boundaries, who recognize periods of continence so that they may give themselves to prayer, who have entered into matrimony for the procreation of children and not for the sake of indulgence." Hippolytus comments on certain women who take both the oral contraceptives and practice vaginal exercises aided with a restrictive strap meant to expel the sperm in order to prevent conception. Women who were reputed believers began to resort to drugs for producing sterility. They also began to gird themselves around so as to expel what was being conceived. for they did not wish to have a child by either a slave or by any paltry fellow, for the sake of their family and excessive wealth. Behold, into how great an impiety the lawless one has proceeded, inculcating adultery and murder at the same time. The Didache and the Epistle to Barnabas both condemn the use of contraception by referring to oral contraceptives or pharmakia, medicine/potions, as murder. Marcus Minucius Felix contrasts Christian women with pagan women who, quote, by drinking drugs extinguish the beginning of a future man, and before they bring forth commit parricide. John Chrysostom, in a sermon circa 390, stated the following: Why do you sow where the field is eager to destroy the fruit, where there are drugs of sterility, where there is murder before birth? You do not even let a harlot remain only a harlot, but you make her a murderess as well. Do you see that from drunkenness comes fornication, from fornication adultery, from adultery murder? Indeed, it is something worse than murder, and I do not know what to call it, for she does not kill what is formed, but prevents its formation. What then? Do you condemn the gift of God and fight with his laws? That which is a curse do you seek as though it were a blessing? Do you make the anteroom of birth the anteroom of slaughter? Do you teach the woman who is given to you for the procreation of offspring to perpetuate killing, that she may always be beautiful and lovable to her lovers, and that she may rake in more money? She does not refuse to do this, heaping fire on your head, and even if the crime is hers, you are the cause. Hence also arise idolatries. To look pretty, many of these women use incantations, libations, charms, potions, and innumerable other things. Yet after such turpitude, after murder, after idolatry, the matter still seems indifferent to many men, even to many men having wives. In this indifference of the married men there is greater evil filth, for then poisons are prepared, not against the womb of a prostitute, but against your injured wife.
Chrysostom again states, in truth, all men know that they who are under the power of this disease, covetousness, are wearied even of their father's old age, and that which is sweet and universally desirable, the having of children, they esteem grievous and unwelcome. Many, at least, with this view have even paid money to be childless, and have mutilated nature, not only killing the newborn, but even acting to prevent their beginning to live. Augustine on the subject of onanism. And why has Paul said, if he cannot control himself, let him marry? Surely to prevent incontinence from constraining him to adultery. If then he practices continence, neither let him marry nor beget children. However, if he does not control himself, let him enter into lawful wedlock, so that he may not beget children in disgrace, or avoid having offspring by a more degraded form of intercourse. There are some lawfully wedded couples who resort to this last for intercourse, even when one's lawfully wedded spouse can take place in an unlawful and shameful manner.
Whenever the conception of offspring is avoided.
Onan, the son of Judah, did this very thing, and the Lord slew him on that account. Therefore, the procreation of children is itself the primary, natural, legitimate purpose of marriage. Whence it follows that those who marry because of their inability to remain continent ought not to so temper their vice that they preclude the good of marriage, which is the procreation of children. Augustine comments on the use of the rhythm method against the Manichaean sect, which employed it as follows. It is not you who used to warn us to ardently look for the period following purification of the menses, when a woman is likely to conceive, and during that time frame from intercourse, so that a soul would not be entangled in the flesh. From this it follows that you do not think marriage is to procreate children, but to satisfy carnal pleasure. Marriage, as the marriage tablets themselves proclaim, unites male and female for the procreation of children. He who practices the rhythm method of the Manichaeans ceases to make the woman a wife, and turns her into a prostitute, who, when she has been given certain gifts, is joined to a man in order to satisfy his lust. Augustine's more direct treatment of the issue in his Marriage and Concupiscence. He states, "It is one thing not to have sex except with the sole purpose of producing children. This has no error. It is another to seek carnal pleasure in having sex, even though it is within the limits of marriage. This has some error. I am supposing, then, that although you are not intentionally having sex for the purpose of procreating offspring, you are not for the purpose of lust obstructing their procreation by an evil prayer or an evil deed. Those who do this, although they are called husband and wife, are not. Nor do they retain any reality of marriage, but with a respectable name cover a shame. Sometimes this lustful cruelty or cruel lust comes to this, that they even produce poisons of sterility. And if these do not work, extinguish and destroy the fetus in some way in the womb, preferring that their offspring die before it lives, or if that was already alive in the womb, to kill it before it was born." The Church in the Middle Ages. Caesarius, Bishop of Arles. "Who is he who cannot give the warning that no woman is to take a potion for the purpose of rendering her incapable of conceiving, or imprison within herself the nature which God willed to be productive? As often as she could have conceived or given birth, of that many homicides she will be held guilty, and unless she undergoes suitable penance, she will be damned by eternal death and hell." Martin Braga, AD 59. Expanding on the decrees of the Council of Ancyra, which originally covered only abortion, declared that a woman who kills her baby once born aborts it before born, or, quote, "takes steps that she may not conceive, either in adultery or in legitimate marriage," unquote, was to do penance for 10 years and can only take communion at her death. Likewise, the First Council of Braga anathematized anyone who condemns human marriage and the procreation of the newborn. Gregory the Great, AD 540 to 604, stated that the married are to be taught that they are to have sex only to produce children. The Irish Collection of Canons, AD 780, condemned contraception as murder in its quotations and allusions, both to Jerome and to Carsius in chapter 3 and 4. The Decretum of Bucard, AD 1010, repeats earlier condemnations by Virginio of Prum, AD 906, and Haligator, the Bishop of Cambrai, AD 830, of women using potions and herbs to prevent contraception. A work by Goretan Adulteri Malium, AD 1140, quoted by Peter Lombard, 1095 through 1160, while speaking of marital acts which hinder or prevent procreation, states, quote, "The evil of adultery surpasses fornication, but is surpassed by incest. For it is worse to sleep with one's mother than with another man's wife. But the worst of all these things is what is done contrary to nature, as when a man wishes to use a part of his wife's body, not made for this." End quote. Noonan remarks that the two have almost identical headings to the topic. Gratian, quote, "They are fornicators, not spouses, who produce poisons of sterility," end quote. And Lombard, quote, "Those who indeed procure poisons of sterility are not spouses, but fornicators," end quote. Thomas Aquinas, AD 1225 through 1274, in his Summa Theologica, condemns sex and marriage when, quote, "the natural course of the sexual act is not kept either by using an unfit organ or because of using other monstrous and bestial purposes for the sexual act," end quote. Noonan comments that this statement encompasses anal intercourse, oral intercourse, coitus interruptus, and departure from the normal position. The last description is most likely an overstatement, but it is clear that Aquinas seeks to condemn the first three. Even Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 through 1400, in the Canterbury Tales, quote, The Parson's Tale, end quote, includes contraception among the 7 deadly sins. Among these are women, quote, drinking poisonous herbs through which she may not conceive, end quote, placing certain material things in her secret places to slay the child, and unnatural intercourse, which is defined as when a man or a woman sheds her nature in manner or in place, so that a child may not be conceived, end quote. Noonan points out that all of these refer to contraception and are distinguished from abortion. St. Bernardino, 5th century, argued that contraceptive methods were, quote, against nature, end quote, and stated, "And I say this to women who are the cause that the children that they have conceived are destroyed. Worse, who also are among those who arrange that they cannot conceive, and if they have conceived, they destroy them in the body. You, to whom this touches, I speak, are more evil than murderers. O cursed by God, when will you repent? Do you not see that you, like the sodomite, are cause for the shrinking of the world? Because you and him, there is no difference." End quote.
When commenting upon Onan's sin in Genesis, Martin Luther in the 16th century said, quote, "Onan must have been a malicious and incorrigible scoundrel. This is the most disgraceful sin. It is far more atrocious than incest and adultery. We call it unchastity, yes, a sodomitic sin. For Onan goes into her, that is, he lies with her and copulates, and when it comes to the point of insemination, spills the semen, lest the woman conceive. Consequently, he deserved to be killed by God. He committed an evil deed, therefore God punished him." Luther argued that Genesis 1:28 was, quote, "a divine ordinance, which it is not our prerogative to hinder or ignore." John Calvin continued the argument against contraception as an act of murder when he commented on Onan's sin. Quote, "Furthermore, he not only shortchanged his brother of his right, but also would rather spill his seed on the ground than to bring forth a son in his brother's lineage. I will try to be as brief as propriety allows in discussing the subject. The purposeful spilling of semen outside of intercourse between man and woman is a monstrous thing. Purposely withdrawing from coitus so that the seed drops on the ground is twice as horrific. For this is to extinguish the hope of the human family and to kill before he is born the hoped-for offspring. This wickedness is here condemned by the Spirit in the most severe manner possible. As though he had, through a violent and premature birth, tore away the seed of his brother out of the womb, and had cruelly and shamefully thrown it on the earth. In this way he tried, as far as he was able, to wipe out a part of the human race. When a woman in some way expels the seed out of the womb, using drugs, then this is rightly seen as an unforgivable crime. And Onan rightfully incurred upon himself the same kind of punishment, polluting the earth with his semen in order that Tamar might not conceive a future human being as an inhabitant of the earth. Calvin's view of this, of course, stemmed from Genesis 1:28. He commented that this command was still in effect to this very day by stating, quote, "Still that pure and lawful method of increase, which God ordained from the beginning, remains firm. This is the law of nature, which common sense declares to be inviolable." The Puritan John Trapp in the 17th century stated of Onan that when he did this thing, the more sinful was this sin of his spilling his seed. The Augsburg Confession itself states that, quote, "God created men for procreation." The annotations of the Synod of Dort in the 17th century state that Onan's sin is the equivalent of tearing out the fruit from the mother's womb. And the Westminster annotations recorded by John Lay in the 17th century commented upon Onan's sin in this way, quote, There is a seminal vital virtue which perishes if the seed be spilled. And by doing this to hinder the begetting of a living child is the first degree of murder that can be committed. And next unto it is the marring of conception, when it is made and causing of abortion. Now such acts are noted in Scripture as horrible crimes, because otherwise many might commit them, and not know the evil of them. It is conceived that his brother before was his brother an evil thus far, that both of them satisfied their sensuality against the order of nature. And therefore the Lord cut them off both alike with sudden vengeance, which may be for terror to those popish Onanites who condemn marriage and live in sodomitical impurity, and to those who in marriage care not for the increase of children, which is the principle of the conjugal estate, but for the satisfying of their own concupiscence. Matthew Poole, in his comments on Genesis, in his Bible commentary, stated that not only was Onan guilty of some sort of hatred for his brother, but a far worse sin, quote, condemned not only by Scripture, but by even the light of nature. It is deemed even a great sin by Poole, where he calls it, quote, a kind of murder. He tells us that this sin is taught to all men by the Holy Spirit here in this text, quote, whereby we may sufficiently understand how wicked and abominable a practice this is amongst Christians. Cotton Mather in the 17th century expounded on the act of coitus interruptus and stated that, quote, the crime against which I warn you is that of self-pollution, which from the name of the only person who stands forever stigmatized for it in our Holy Bible bears the name of onanism. Matthew Henry in the 17th century in his well-known commentary states that the sins such as Onan's spilling of his seed, quote, dishonor the body and defile it, and thus are, quote, very displeasing to God. John Wesley had a much harsher criticism of the sin in the following statement. He says, quote, Onan, though he consented to marry the widow, yet to the great abuse of his own body, of the wife he had married, and the memory of his brother that was gone, he refused to raise up seed unto his brother. Those sins that dishonor the body are very displeasing to God, and the evidence of vile affections. Observe the thing which he did displeased the Lord, and it is to be feared. Thousands, especially of single persons, by this very thing, still displease the Lord and destroy their own souls. Kyle and Delitzsch, in their conservative commentary in the 19th century, argue that the sin Onan committed was, quote, a sin against the divine institution of marriage and its object, and was therefore punished by Jehovah with sudden death. Herbert Leupold, on his commentary on Genesis 1:28, said, quote, after verse 26 has now given the summary account of the creation of one pair, male and female, verse 27 proceeds to have the divine command laid upon this pair, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The primary purpose of marriage is here indicated. John R. Rice in 1946 commented, quote, the use of contraceptive devices to prevent the conception and birth of children is wrong because it goes against the clear tenor of Bible teaching. The Bible teaches that to have large families is a positive good, a blessing from God. If it is a virtue to have large families, then it is a lack of virtue to limit the family to less than what it would be if God had his way and gave the children that he wants to give to a home. Since married couples are commanded to multiply and replenish the earth, then not to multiply is a sin. It seems also that we may properly infer from the general tenor of Scripture that to want less children than God would give without human rebellion and contraceptive devices is likewise a sin. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, stated, As regards contraceptives, there is a paradoxical, negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those who already alive. By contraception, simply they are denied existence. By contraception used as a means of selective breeding, they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer. From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument.
Well, I think we've thrown a lot of information out. I think this is a good place to stop. We are going to do a part 2, so there'll be more coming at everybody. I know this probably has raised a ton of questions. There is a comment section on the bottom. I'm not promising that we'll get to everyone's comments. We're busy and stuff.
Maybe if there are enough comments, we can make a Q&A
Yeah.
video and actually address those comments.
Well,
Yeah.
I imagine there'll be a part 2 and a part 3,
Yeah.
and maybe even actually a part 4. So we'll see how
I
that
mean,
goes.
part 2, we will go through biblical arguments.
But last thing I would want to say is, remember, God is a God who creates. We are His image bearers. Therefore, we are to be creational. God has clearly showed us and commanded us how to be creational in marriage and having children. And we should do everything in our power to fulfill and obey Christ's commandments. I would say this is a command from Christ. And we remember in John where Christ says, abide in me as I abide in the Father. And how do I abide in the Father? Well, Christ says He obeys His commandments. So abide in me and obey Christ's commandments. Let us do that as a church and bring more covenant children into this world so we can live with them in eternity.
That's our podcast for Beggars Canyon, and you can support us on Patreon.
We don't have a Patreon.
We're going to Oxford and talking to famous people.
You can
Actually, I do want to set up a Patreon.
Okay,
All
well,
right.
you can like and subscribe for now.
Like and subscribe. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.